Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another Supatease video. And in this one, we are going to be reviewing the Fire Mage, everything that's changing, all of the new things incoming, some of my thoughts and opinions on some potentially cool and awesome builds and ideas, and more importantly, if it's going to look like a right fit for you, as that is the purpose of the channel here. I'm going to be reviewing every single specialization for Shadowlands and trying to provide as much information as I can to you so that your decision making process of picking one of these classes is a little bit easier. So the Fire Mage is receiving probably one of the biggest adjustments of all of the Fire Mage specializations overall. Just throwing that out there at the start of it. So if you're looking for maybe a bit more of a fresh experience having played Fire Mage in the past, it's likely to provide that. But let's take a look at the spell book first and foremost. You're going to be getting a mage spell book, which means these spells are available to all mages, and then a fire mage spell book chapter, I guess, that will be only spells available to the fire mage. Spells returning to all mages are such as the Arcane Explosion, a nice little utility to find stealth targets, whether there's a patrolling monster or an enemy rogue or druid. This is definitely going to be a niche and useful spell for finishing off targets when they might have been just one more cast away from going down and you don't have any other instant cast ability, and it's going to serve that purpose. Arcane Intellect has been reduced in its power down to 5% intellect to the group. However, you're pretty much going to be the only one providing this buff, as unique class buffs are coming back in Shadowlands. So even though it is reduced, it's still going to be a big benefit to your group when it comes to raiding and dungeons. Moving forward, we've got Frostbolt returning to fire, so getting a little bit of ice back here on the Fire Mage, which is great as you didn't otherwise really have a slow unless you talented out of Shimmer. So this is a great addition into the toolkit. Unfortunately, it's not doing the most amount of damage. So aside from maybe engaging a pull with a monster to keep it slowed, and maybe for Torghast or solo content play, you might see a lot of use in this. But in things like Mythic Plus or raiding or even PvP, the slow and the cast time is generally not as valued, and more often than not, you're going to play with a class that has a slow that's better anyways. You may only find yourself pressing this if you were interrupted on Arcane and Fire, which is really unlikely. So outside of some niche uses and some solo content, if you're worried about it being an extra keybind, I think you'll be fine with general performance, not even worrying about it. But it's there if you want to use it for that extra utility, or possibly as a puzzle piece to something in Torghast, like there's a monster that moves towards you and it hits you at one shots you or something along those lines. Slowing it with this would be useful. Mirror images are returning baseline to mages. However, this iteration is much more of a defensive utility, as they are now providing damage reduction. While your images are active, damage taken is reduced by 20%. Taking direct damage will cause one of the images to dissipate. So if you didn't already have enough defense as a fire mage, you get even more defense, but you can see they don't really hit that hard. They're hitting for 17 damage. You're not going to press this for damage. This is purely a damage reduction cooldown. It's going to be helpful for you in things like Torghast, again, solo content, PvP especially, and I guess in raids as well. If you were trying to somewhat hold on to your Cauterize, you knew there was maybe a big hitting attack incoming, you could activate these prior to that. But there are other cooldowns that are coming back to the mage that you may want to utilize in its place, and that is going to be Alter Time. So Alter Time is coming back to the Fire Mage. 1 minute cooldown, you alter the fabric of time, returning you to your current location and health when you cast a second time after 10 seconds. Otherwise, the effect is negated by long distance or death. So a bit of a gamble you can play with this game. If you know that there's a hard-hitting attack incoming, you activate this at a high health right before it happens. The hard-hitting attack hits you, and then you bounce back, and you'll be back to your original location and maximum health. Super fun ability in turn when it comes to defensive cooldowns. It's definitely unique and nice to see return, but it's not the same iteration as it was in Mists of Pandaria, where it would save all of your procs all of your hot streaks, and you could come back in time and just blast somebody down for a second round, you're not going to get that offensive benefit. It's purely defensive. And it's important to note that when it comes to PvP, where this is really going to play an important role, is that Temporal Shield has been removed, which was a very similar effect. You activated Temporal Shield, you got hit really hard, and then it healed the damage back. So you did lose the Temporal Shield for Honor Talents and PvP to gain access to this, which has a lot more use to it. And with a longer cooldown, it was probably justified, with Mage survivability being quite high in PvP and arguably in PvE as well. Phoenix Flames is coming back baseline, which is just the 40-yard, 25-second recharge. Hurl of Phoenix that deals 1,035 fire damage to the target and reduced damage to nearby targets. Awesome to see some of these Legion artifacts return baseline to specializations. I would have liked to have seen it return to more of the specializations, but that's probably for a video at another time. Phoenix Flames, though, is going to have a secondary purpose, which is now spreading your Ignite to nearby targets. So instead of Ignite spreading on its own, you can take control of the Ignite by activating your Phoenix Flames after stacking up a lot of big crits and getting a massive Ignite on the target. You can activate Phoenix Flames and spread it to other targets. This is much more in line with the original flavor of Fire. I say original flavor of Fire Mage. It's more like my most biased favorite version of Fire Mage, which was the Cataclysm Fire Mage, where you would stack up this massive Ignite. And back then it was Combustion would spread the Ignite to multiple targets. Now it's the Phoenix Flames. So getting that flavor back of being this kind of melt your face, damage over time effect Fire Mage is really awesome. And I'm glad to see them do an iteration of it that is at least very similar to previous executed versions of this. But in terms of power and performance, you're going to notice a significant drop off from your Fire Mage at the end of Battle for Azeroth, where you have Essences, Lucid Dreams, you have Arcana, Latent Arcana Crystal, I think was the name of it in PvE. You were doing a lot of ridiculous damage when you lined up all of your cooldowns together. The same could be said in PvP as well. Between Greater Pyroblast and Combustion, you were able to really put out a lot of damage. At the moment, Fire Mage is parsing as the lowest mage specialization. It's at a loss of all of that gear and all of that power you developed through Battle for Azeroth, and likely as a part of the rework, right? Having to manually spread your Ignite, there's going to be a lot more room for error, which means a lot more room for lower damage potential. I am a bit worried about Fire Mage in terms of its overall performance. While it's getting some great flavor and utility returned back to the specialization, it's one that I'm a bit hesitant to recommend just at this time in terms of tuning. Now, the talents have seen some readjustments, some nerfs, some buffs, and some new ones. On the first row, nothing new. Still likely in PvE that Searing Touch is your go-to. In PvP, it's also not that bad. Firestarter is a good substitute, and then Pyromaniac is just kind of dead talent. So I would avoid it. Moving down to the second row, we're not going to see any changes other than Blast Wave lasts an additional second. Woo! 1 second longer on that slow. Golly gee, that makes me want to lock this one in. Now, it might have place in solo Torghast. I can see maybe Torghast where Blast Wave could serve a purpose, but when it comes to just general playstyle of the Mage and what makes the Mage feel good, it's almost as if Shimmer should be baseline in that regard. And it's still probably going to be the one you go to, even though it got its cooldown increased to 25 seconds. It still just feels really good to cast and then blink out of something or blink away from something. It just has felt really good, and it's still likely to be the baseline go-to. Incanter's Flow hasn't seen any changes. Focus Magic is a new talent to replace Mirror Images. 1,000 mana, 40-yard range. Increase the target's chance to critically hit with spells by 5% for 30 minutes. When the target critically hits, your chance to critically hit with spells is increased by 5% for 10 seconds, and it cannot be cast on yourself. It has to be on an ally. The main problem with this one is that in PvP, Incanter's Flow is just a really nice, don't really have to worry about it, increase of damage. But I'm actually thinking the new Rune of Power, the buffed Rune of Power, is likely to just supersede both of them in definitely PvE, but also probably PvP. And Rune of Power now is a 1.4 second cast time, 45 second cooldown. You place a Rune of Power on the ground, which increases your spell damage by 40% while you stand within 8 yards. However, now casting Combustion will also create a Rune of Power at your location. And if anybody anybody who's experienced the Fire Mage knows, you're pretty much only doing damage with combustion. And in PvP, you were only doing damage with greater pyro or combustion, and everything else in between was lackluster, to say the least. So this talent synergizing so heavily with a very important cooldown in all aspects of the game makes me think that it's going to be the go-to just for all content in all environments. Now on the next row, Flame On doesn't receive any changes. It's just reducing the cooldown of your Fire Blast by 2 seconds, and you get one more charge of it. This is something that just feels really good with Fire Mage, and I almost wonder if it should just be baseline to the specialization. Should just get your hot streaks going with an extra charge and a reduced cooldown. So it's still probably the go-to, even though Alexstrasza's Fury has been buffed to also increase the damage done by your next Pyroblast or Flame Strike by 35% after casting Dragon's Breath. And it also contributes to your hot streak. There could be some interesting Flame Strike builds with some of the conduits when we get to the conduit section of the video, and potentially some honor talents as well in PvP with the World in Flames, increasing the damage of your Flame Strike by 20%, Alexstrasza's Fury, increasing your damage of Flame Strike by 35%, and some conduits to increase the damage of Flame Strike. It's probably more so in PvP that I'm curious to see how this plays out on Fire Mage, if we see the return of a Flame Strike spamming mage, but maybe potential in PvE. It seems like a bit of a gimmick, and Flame On is just so good as a solid, just auto lock-in talent on this row that I kind of doubt it, but there could be some cheeky opportunities to try it out. From the Ashes is going to be replacing Wake, replacing your Phoenix Flames. I almost said Wake of Ashes because it's a Ret Paladin one, but From the Ashes is a passive. It increases your mastery by 2% for each charge of Phoenix Flames off cooldown, and your direct damage critical strikes reduce its cooldown by 1%. I don't really see this getting much play over Flame On. Just Flame On feels so good. I kind of feel like Flame On should just be baseline, and then these other talents that do add some interesting flavor to the spec would get some play. Maybe later on when our stats are higher, From the Ashes ends up being a bit better. But early on, I think it's pretty easy to just go for Flame On at this point. No changes to Frenetic Speed, still just a sprint when you Scorch. No changes to Ice Ward, just 2 charges of Frost Nova. Might have some good synergies with legendaries to run this talent a little more often. Ring of Frost got a buff, which is a bit surprising. It was already a really good crowd control that you placed on the ground in a circle, but now when a target comes out of being frozen, they're also slowed by 65% for 4 seconds. That's going to be really annoying for healers when you crowd control them and then they want to get back to the target to heal them and they're slowed. Going to be very useful in Torghast and dungeons for trying to kite monsters, obviously. So a nice buff to a spell that has been kind of niche to the mage since its introduction to the mage. Living Bomb is having some reductions in its capabilities as well on this row, even though it wasn't really taken in PvE, and you would take it in PvP, but it wasn't really that big of a deal that you did it. You kind of just used it as a filler button, but it's getting a little bit weaker overall is basically all I can say for it. Conflagration is still likely the go-to when it comes to PvE to just get extra damage onto multiple targets, and then maybe a Flame Patch build, especially in PvP, as I said, with so many things with the word Flame Strike and more damage tied together. Flame Patch and PvP probably more likely to see than Conflagration in PvE. So a bit curious to see how this row plays out. It's a little bit more competitive, but it is unfortunate to see Living Bomb reduced in its capability. Kindling got a buff, which is great for PvE. Your Fireball, Pyroblast, and Phoenix Flames critically strikes reduce the remaining cooldown on combustion by 1.5 seconds, which has been increased. Now again, because you're a spec that does all your damage in combustion, in PvE this is pretty much mandatory. In PvP you might see more use of this, especially with one of the Covenant abilities. When we get to the Covenant abilities, it could make Kindling a little more competitive with Firestarter for the honor talents in PvP. But obviously good old Meteor in PvP, you can't really go wrong. You get crowd control on the healer, you plop this baby down and blow somebody up, right? Nothing's changed there in Meteor. Pyroclasm is now consuming Hot Streak, has a 15% chance to make your next non-instant Pyroblast cast within 15 seconds, deal 240% additional damage, and it stacks twice. Main problem with this is that it's only a 15% chance. That's the main problem. So your guarantee of ever actually getting this to the point where it is 2 stacks is very low. But 580% additional damage on a hard-casted Pyroblast could be nuts. It could be the equivalent of a greater Pyro in PvE, but it's such a low chance, and giving up Kindling, which plays so well into your class, the way your class works, or Meteor for just instant damage in PvP, it's hard to see Pyroclasm really have a place in the game. There's no new honor talents other than, as I said, the removal of Temporal Shield, and also that Greater Pyroblast has a 15-second cooldown. So we said it in the earlier part of the video, Fire Mages only do damage in Combustion, and in PvP they only did Combustion and Greater Pyro. So now your Greater Pyro has a cooldown. You might struggle a bit here if Fire Mage isn't tuned adequately in terms of being competitive. But let's take a look here now at the Necrolords and what they're going to offer to us in terms of Covenant spells. For Fleshcraft, you're going to get a Channeled Shield, and after 4 seconds, you'll get a shield equal to 20% of your maximum health. The main utility of this that I see is the Ultimate Form, which is a talent within the Necrolords, deeper within the Necrolords that you can take. So when you're channeling Fleshcraft, you're immune to crowd control. If you complete the channel without being interrupted, you're immune to crowd control for a further 4 seconds. This has a really high skill cap in the game in all aspects. If you anticipate a monster to stun you or crowd control you, and you activate this to avoid that, you're going to get a lot more damage during a phase of an encounter than another player who is not doing this. And same goes for PvP. If you anticipate a rogue wanting to go for a stun on you, you can start channeling Fleshcraft. Now the rogue either needs to use Kick on you on Fleshcraft, which means you can use the rest of your spells, or they don't use Kick and they have to wait, or they kidney shot into immunity and you've put their stun on cooldown. This has a lot of potential for crazy outplay in the game in general. So it's a really underrated one at the moment in my mind for secondaries, but it seems really awesome from what I've gotten to play with it. And then Deathborn, which is now 2,500 mana, 1.4 second cast, 3-minute cooldown, transform into a powerful skeletal mage for 20 seconds. It's Incarnation, Ascendance, or whatever you want to think about it for mages. Really powerful cooldown. While in the form of a skeletal mage, your Frostbolt, Fireball, and Arcane Blast hit up to 2 enemies near your target, and your spell damage is increased by 10%. So for massive, just kind of monster damage, I'll just show you this. So the Fleshcraft, you would be immune channeling it. You finish the channel, you'd be immune to crowd control even longer. And then for the Deathborn, you transform into a really badass looking skeleton, and then you just start mashing out some big fireballs. So this is probably going to be one of the best, I would think, for Mythic Plus. As just making your single target spell AoE is never a bad thing. You're going to do a lot of trash damage with this. In PvP, I feel like you're going to struggle a bit because it's kind of telegraphed. You have to hard cast it. They're going to see that it's happening and maybe avoid it. You're probably likely breaking crowd control, and you rely on that a lot in PvP. So it's got some really big drawbacks. Maybe you wouldn't even really necessarily use this in PvP for the Fireball AoE. You would just use it for 10% more spell damage. But a 3-minute cooldown for 10% is a pretty big cost. So in my mind, this is a Covenant that is leaning more heavily to Mythic Plus or heavy trash encounter bosses, like the more ad phases of bosses. It would have its uses there. Some of the PvP saving factors could be the immunity during Fleshcraft, but if you're interested in Mythic Plus, it seems like it would be a better go-to. The Venthyr, we've got Door of Shadows, probably the best mobility cooldown in the game in my mind. And more importantly, it's a shadow spell, so if you're interrupted while casting it, you can do everything else a mage wants to do. So more mobility. Shimmer, Shimmer, Door of Shadows, you can go up and down. There's a lot of fun stuff you can do with this. Easily one of the most fun and also impactful Covenant spells to all classes. And then Mirrors of Torment, 2,000 mana, 1.4 second cast, 1.5 minute cooldown. Conjure 3 mirrors to torment the enemy for 20 seconds. Whenever the target casts a spell or ability, a mirror is consumed to inflict 833 shadow damage, and their movement speed and cast speeds are slowed by 15%. The final mirror will instead inflict 2,200 shadow damage to the enemy, rooting and silencing them for 4 seconds. In my mind, for the Fire Mage, the Venthyr stands out as like a PvP covenant, because deeper within the Soulbinds, you have interrupt reduction by 25%. Deeper into the Soulbinds, you have 10% damage reduction below 40% health, which is really good for Fire Mage to avoid your Cauterize triggering. And the extra mobility from the Door of Shadows, and the fact that these are shadow spells, so if you're interrupted on them, you can still do a whole bunch of other things. It stands out as, in my mind, a better PvP choice than a PvE one. I'm interested to see how they tune it and they balance it to make it more competitive as a PvE option, but this is something that stands out for me for PvP. You got the Door of Shadows teleport, really cool animation, and it's really laggy right now. All right. And then Mirrors of Torment. Now, if they start casting, their cast speeds are going to be reduced, and then eventually they're going to be silenced. So you're going to get a lot of utility out of that. You can punish enemy healers in PvP if they dispel one of your polymorphs, then go for a Mirror of Torment, maybe a swap to a healer, you stun them, and then Mirror of Torment. Maybe play with an Affliction Warlock with Unstable Affliction. So if they want to dispel it, they're going to take a pretty hefty hit. So really good synergies there. And I think it is going to be important to play with an Affliction Warlock, assuming that they don't get nerfed too badly or stay as a strong specialization, because their Unstable Affliction to protect your Ignite with the way that you spread it now, and this Mirror of Torment in PvP is going to be super important. But to me, the Venthyr stand out as a more of a PvP covenant choice. Then for the Night Fae, we've got a pretty interesting one. So we're gonna get Soul Shape, which is like a Ghost Wolf Blink. 1.5 minute cooldown, you turn into a Vulpin, you teleport 15 yards forward, and it increases your movement speed by 50%. You may reactivate Soul Shape every few seconds to teleport again. So it's probably better as just like a straightforward mobility to get to your target and get around in an emergency, but the ability to go up and down hills over holes in the ground from the Venthyr is still a really good benefit. And then Shifting Power, which is a 2500 mana channel, 45-second cooldown. You draw power from the ground, dealing nature damage over 3.7 seconds to enemies within 18 yards. While you're channeling, your mage ability cooldowns are reduced by 12 seconds over 3.7 seconds. The reason I'm curious to see if this has any utility, maybe more so to do with PvP, but with Kindling reducing the cooldown of your combustion, Firestarter in PvP reducing the cooldown of your combustion, and then also Shifting Power to reduce the cooldown of your combustion. So if we pop combustion, and then we just go ham on the mob, right? And then, all right, we want to get our combustion back. We're going to do a bit of damage, and we're going to start reducing the cooldown of our combustion. It seems like it could be good. Now, it depends on how they tune it and where it's parsing. So if you want to pick this based on performance, it would be probably wise to look at the parsings as when the game comes out. But it could be kind of fun, right? To go for these sort of big combust resets. Try and, in PvP, catch a target off guard as they don't expect your combustion to be off cooldown. It does seem like it fits better with Fire Mage than any of the other specializations, because in between your combustions, you could just start dropping this as a big AoE hit on top of the fact that it gives your combustion back. But the drawbacks are that it's channeled, really easy to interrupt. You need to be pretty close to the targets to use it. So it's got some downsides to it. But then for the Vulpin, you're going to be able to blink, run really fast, get away from enemies. Or get on top of healers in PvP, get out of AoE circles on the ground. On top of having blinks, I mean, you're never going to be getting caught in anything with this. You could also get the Pod Tender as a talent deeper within the Soulbinds, which is like a cheat death. You already have that as a Fire Mage with Cauterize, but more cheat deaths the better. Now for Kyrian, we've got the Summon Steward, which will come and deliver you a vial or a hellstone, really big OP hellstone, 20% of your health, and it will remove all curses, disease, poisons, and bleeds. There's a prevalent amount of bleeds in the current PvE content, so it will get strong usage there. If you were running something like a dwarf or a dark iron dwarf mage, you would have 2 ways to remove bleeds and these types of effects, so you'd be really annoying in PvP to classes like feral druids and rogues, and who doesn't like being more annoying to rogues, because rogues are really annoying. So it's definitely got a lot of utility. You don't have a way to really heal as a fire mage, so getting access to a heal when you're doing solo content, maybe out in the world, or Torghast, it's going to have good secondary benefits. And then for Radiant Spark, which is the specs or class specific covenant ability. 1000 mana, 1.4 second cast, 30-second cooldown. Conjure a radiant spark that causes 784 arcane damage instantly and an additional 325 damage over 8 seconds. The target takes 10% increased damage from your direct damage spells, stacking each time they are struck. This effect ends after 4 spells. So you see how you get like the 10% buff, same thing as the Necrolords, but you get it every 30 seconds, which lines up with your combustion a lot better. This would be like I feel like a good middle of the road covenant. Like, you can make this work in all of the content. Probably not as good as the Necrolord for Mythic Plus, depending on how they tune Night Fae, but with Fire Mage and Combustion, it could end up being really good. And then over there with the Venthyr, with PvP, with silences and mobility and interrupt reductions and damage reductions, it's like your PvP one. And then this one, in my mind, stands as like, you're going to be able to do everything in the game. You're not going to perform at the 100% optimal endpoint, but hopefully after tuning, you're maybe 10% worse, but you can do all of the stuff. So you might want to consider that when you're picking the covenants, but let's take a look at these abilities. Steward will deliver you a little Healthstone, and you can also talk to him if you need a friend. Who doesn't want a friend, right? You get a talent change, you get some other benefits, right? You can tell apparently one of your friends how great they are. That's interesting. But the Radiant Spark, so we can pop off with Radiant Spark. We could pop Combustion. We could just start dropping big hits on it. Spread and Ignite maybe with it. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Activate it on the target. Blast the target down with Combustion. Your Combustion does more blasting. Pretty straightforward. Other effects would be that you can get knockbacks within the Soulbinds of the Kyrian. So when you consume your vial, it knocks all targets away from you. That might be useful to you on Sanguine and Mythic Plus, or just knocking monsters out of anything on the ground that you don't want them to be in. Knockbacks generally not a bad thing to have, and Fire Mages don't have one as a baseline really, at least not as strong as the one you would get from this. And then also you get stun reductions on yourself. If you're standing still for a period of time, you'll then have all incoming stuns reduced by 30%, all incoming polymorphs and root effects reduced by 30%. That's also pretty good for PvP. So the covenants, I feel like you can't really go wrong if you go Kyrian, but if you really wanted an edge and that big badass skeleton look cool to you, the Necrolords for Mythic Plus is probably an alright pick. PvP, pretty safe going Venthyr if that's where you want your focus to be. Now let's jump into the juicy stuff. Now let's jump into the legendaries, which are actually not that legendary for Fire Mage. I made that sound a lot more impressive than they actually are. Disciplinary Command. Casting a Frost, Fire, and Arcane spell within 10 seconds of each other increases your critical strike damage of all your spells by 10%. The amount of awkwardness to this is what really kind of holds it back. You would have to cast Frostbolt, maybe a Fire Blast, and then Arcane Explosion. Mostly the Frostbolt part of this. I guess you could do Frost Nova. If you did Frost Nova, Fire Blast, Arcane Explosion, you could get this. And basically the main benefit would be is that your Combustion does 10% more damage, right? So you would set this up prior to a Combustion and get 10% more damage on it. I feel like I see this as unlikely being that great in PvE. It's probably okay. Maybe in PvP, where you need to be setting up for your combustion windows, this would give you a little bit of an extra jump on it. So it's not outright awful. It's just kind of weird. Maybe that's okay, but when other legendaries are a little more straightforward, weird kind of just falls to the wayside. Expanded Potential. Your Fireball has a chance to give you expanded potential, which causes your next hot streak to not be consumed. This really depends on the proc rate as to whether or not it will be good. If you're only getting this like very rarely, it's not that great. But if the proc rate's good on it, you can't go wrong getting a free instant Pyroblast. So really just depends on the proc rate. Grizzly Icicle. Your Frost, Fire, and Arcane damage against enemies afflicted by your Frost Nova is increased by 10%, and you no longer break it. This is almost entirely Torghast or PvP. In Torghast, I could see this being useful. If you pull a giant hallway, you can Frost Nova and then AoE the crap out of it without it breaking. Going to be really helpful there. And then in PvP, same thing. You got a warrior chasing you. The warrior's already irritated that they're in a Frost Nova. They're now even more pissed off because they're dying in the Frost Nova and it doesn't break. So it could be really annoying in those situations. And then Triune Ward. Casting a barrier spell grants the effects of the other barriers available to other mages, so slows and magic dot reductions, and the absorb effects at a 40% effectiveness, a defensive oriented one. So if you were wanting to do in PvP like dueling or 1v1s, probably PvP in general, this one's good for fire because the other legendaries are so... I'm talking about competitive PvP, like rated 3v3. Maybe dueling, that's not competitive PvP, but dueling also. This would be a good one. Just makes you more durable. Gives you good purge protection too, because it would be 3 magic buffs. So if you wanted to protect something like your combustion from being dispelled, you would be able to activate these 3 barriers and then pop your combustion, and you kind of cover your bases there. So it's got some use there in PvP. And Torghast as well, if you're by yourself, giving yourself more shields. Never going to really be a bad thing. Also, you'd get the slowing benefit of the ice barrier from melee attackers. So Torghast PvP, again, kind of, that's where that one's shining out to me at the moment. Now, the Fire Mage specific legendaries. We've got Fevered Incantation. Each consecutive critical strike you deal increases critical strike damage you deal by 2%. So this is a lot more straightforward than that first one that we read that was like cast 3 spells, you get 10% crit damage. This is just during combust, you ramp this up. So if that one seems like it would fit really well into the class. Performance-wise, we're going to have to wait and see until they parse everything and they tune it. I don't want to tell you like this is the highest performer because it could be nerfed or buffed. I'm just trying to tell you based on feel and the content where I see this working out. I feel like this is something that would work in all content of the game, and it's a solid effect. More crit damage, synergizes well with combustion, important cooldown in all content of the game. That's my logic. Now, Firestorm, when Hot Streak activates, you have a low chance to cause all Pyroblasts and Flame Strikes to have no cast time and be guaranteed critical strikes for 5 seconds. Now that seems like it could be nuts with a Flame Strike build. And then when we get into the conduits next year, I mean, I'm going to try in the beta, which if you didn't know, I'm streaming on twitch.tv/Supatease. I really want to try a Flame Strike Fire Mage with that Firestorm legendary. If you get that and you've got World in Flames and maybe even try the Dragon's Breath, Alexstrasza's Fury, and then you just start boom, 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 Flame Strikes all over. That could be kind of cool. Again, it depends on the proc rate as to whether or not this ends up being super competitive. If you want something guaranteed and consistent, then Fevered Incantation. If you want something that could be kind of cheeky and a little bit random to it, but maybe a big payout if you get it, then Firestorm seems cool. Molten Skyfall, damaging an enemy with 30 fireballs or pyroblasts calls down a meteor on your target. Hitting an enemy player counts as double. Why is it 30? Isn't the Frost Mage has the same legendary, but it's 15 and then it casts Frozen Orb. Why is it 30? Is it because you can get instant Pyroblasts, whereas Frostbolt isn't? But you get instant, I think it's Flurries also for Frost Mages are instant, at least when you use them. This seems really weird that it's twice as much. Also, Frozen Orb seems like a lot stronger of a cooldown to get than Meteor for Fire Mage. Maybe if they readjusted this, I could see this being really good. It would probably be ridiculously good if it gave you combustion after you did that. That's probably too good. But I feel like tuning that down a bit, shaving off some fireballs required for that, and it could be a pretty good one. In PvP, you got the downside of that meteor spawning maybe when you don't want it to, and it breaks crowd control, or the enemy target moves out of it. So this one's definitely not as good as the Frost iteration, in my mind, in any content. Now, the Sun King's Blessing. After consuming 6 hot streaks, your next instant cast Pyroblast within 15 seconds grants you combustion for 6 seconds. Okay, that seems really good in everything. I mean, aside from tuning, I don't even need to have the tuning for these legendaries to tell you something gives me combustion, and I'm a competitive Fire Mage player. I want that. I only do damage with combustion. You're giving me a legendary that gives me combustion. I want that. Okay. We can pretty much write off everything else that I've talked about. This seems like at the moment, that would be the legendary that you would want to get in all content. And then in PvP, right when you're about to cast that next Pyroblast, you know you're going to get combustion, save it till you got a polymorph on the healer. In Mythic Plus or raiding, you just pop that bad boy as soon as you can get it. You try and get as many combustions out. You got kindling to reduce the cooldown of your combustion. Maybe you try and experiment with Night Fae to get the cooldown of your main combustion down, to get more combustions. You can never go wrong with more combustions. That seems like a really good one for Fire Mage. Soulbind Conduits. These are a new feature of Shadowlands. Think of them as gems for your Covenant talent trees, and then you'll put them in and you'll level them up and they'll get better and better. So potency is damage. So these are damage gems. Controlled destruction, pyroblast damage is increased by 5%, and as you level this up, it's more and more. Really good. Can't go wrong with pyroblast damage. Pretty straightforward. Flame accretion. Fireball grants 5% mastery when it fails to critically strike. Little bit of a drawback required to having it fail on a critical strike. We'll have to wait and see what the other ones offer. Master Flame. Flame strikes damage and radius are increased by 6 seconds. Again, maybe in PvP and possibly Mythic Plus, but I kind of feel like not Mythic Plus because the World in Flames is an honor talent. So PvP might be cool to get a really big Flame Strike build here with that conduit. That could be cheeky. Or if you wanted to mix in Flame Strike damage and Pyroblast damage so you're decent at AoE and single target rather than relying on the RNG for mastery. Infernal Cascade. While Combustion is active, we like Combustion. Your Fire Blast grants you 3% increased fire damage for 5 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. Okay, you can't really go wrong with that, right? Especially with that Sun King's legendary. This is going to get you a lot of damage. So Pyroblast damage, pretty straightforward. Probably Infernal Cascade, depending on how many potency conduits are available on your talent tree that you're going for. Those are two that I think stand out the most. When we scroll down here, we've got Covenant conduits for potency, which will buff the spells that we looked at for the Covenants. Ire of the Ascended. Radiant Spark increases the damage of your spells by an additional 2%, which initially you're like, oh, it's not that much. But you'd level this up, so it would be more and more and more and more damage. So if you really want to pump it into that Radiant Spark, it depends. You probably would almost always want to stack it with Combustion in PvE, but in PvP, it might be as usable as a secondary burst window. So you use a Combustion to get a cooldown, and then you try and use a Radiant Spark to get a kill. You could split them. In PvE, generally, you probably want to stack them for maximum damage, and even PvP, you still want to stack them, but pretty straightforward. You just get more damage out of the Radiant Spark. Siphoned Malice for Venthyr. Each time a Mirrors of Torment is consumed, your spell damage is increased by 1% for 10 seconds, stacking 3 times. Again, it stacks up more and more as you level up the conduit. Brings in some more throughput to the Mirrors of Torment, which is what it was lacking in PvE. There's a conduit, so if you wanted to focus on PvP and you went Venthyr, getting this conduit would help you out in dungeons and raids, definitely bringing up some of the downsides to it. Gift of the Lich. Deathborn's duration is increased by 3 seconds. Can't go wrong with that when it comes down to just spamming up big AoE fireballs, burning everything down to the ground. Seems like would be a pretty good go-to if you were going to be playing Necrolord to have as a potency conduit. Discipline of the Grove for Night Fae. Shifting Power channels 5% faster, so you get the benefits of its cooldown reduction, and you get its damage output out more likely without getting stunned or interrupted or having to move, or the general downsides of it. To me, at the moment, Night Fae is the most odd one, as the other ones are just do more damage in silence, do more damage. This one's get your cooldowns back faster, but does it do as much damage as that one? Does it do as much damage as that one? We'll have to wait and see. And again, some of the other secondary parts of the Night Fae give you benefits that Fire Mage already has, like cheat deaths. So you might be able to make it work if you really had your heart set on being a Night Fae, just building your character around Combustion and getting more Combustions out and then jumping in to pop this for big AoE. It's possible you could make it work if you really had your heart set on it, but if you're worried about being super competitive, it's one that is standing out as kind of risky to take in my mind. Now for endurance conduits, this is defense. We got the Cryo Freeze. While inside Ice Block, you heal for 20% of your maximum health. Going to be great for your own personal recovery in PvP, Torghast, in Raid too, but not that big of a deal in Raid in my mind. Diverted Energy. Your barriers heal you for 20% of the damage absorbed. Might have really good synergies with that Triune legendary where you got 3 shields and then all those barriers also heal you. That would be really good if you wanted to do Torghast in my mind. Really good if you wanted to do random battlegrounds by yourself. Really good if you wanted to duel and do 1v1s and maybe make 1v1 PvP montages. It would be really good. Competitively in PvE, it's okay. It's this middle of the pack, right? You got long cooldown heal, medium cooldown heal, but if you went for that legendary, it becomes pretty beefy heal. And then for the Tempest Barrier, you gain a shield that absorbs 5% of your maximum health for 15 seconds after you blink. Pretty small amount of your health. In my mind, the barrier one is, I'm always like focused towards PvP because I don't think the benefits of these will matter in PvE, whereas the benefit will matter in PvP. So picking the one that's the best for PvP makes the most sense to me. That's the logic I'm using. And getting 20% of the heal on a big shield, especially if you're running the Triune Legendary, which in PvP you will, PvE probably not, obviously with that Sun Blessing one, but this one seems like it would be good in all content and especially PvP. Then for finesse conduits, the final part of this is utility. Flow of time. The cooldown of blink is reduced by 1 second. So if you wanted to undo the nerf to shimmer, there's a conduit. There you go. You can undo that. They nerfed it and then give you something to grind to get the old benefit you had. That's a good move by them. That's a good move. That's clever. Incantation of swiftness. Invisibility increases your movement speed by 20%. Maybe okay for a skip. Invisibility is just generally maybe in Torghast if you needed to get past a pack and you wanted that extra speed. PvP at the start of a game if you wanted to get across the map to polymorph someone out of invisibility. But just getting your blink on a shorter cooldown is so good that I don't think that like niche extra bit from your invisibility is going to be too great. Winter's Protection. The cooldown of Ice Block is reduced by 30 seconds. Still a pretty long cooldown. I don't think it's going to change the cycle in PvE, going down from like 5-minute cooldown to 4.5. You're not going to get 2 ice blocks where you would have otherwise got 1. Maybe if you ranked it up all of the way. I guess you got to think about the late game, right? Like how many seconds at a max rank are you going to get off your ice block? Is it minutes? Because then it becomes pretty good in terms of defense. But I still think having your blink is going to be more beneficial. Grounding Surge. Successfully interrupting an enemy with counterspell reduces its cooldown by 1 second. Man, these are tough. This is tough. Like this one's got some niche usage. It's like you can somewhat ignore it, but Blink is really powerful. I guess if you really wanted PvE, it's probably the Ice Block one. Just because you'll be able to cycle an extra cooldown with your healers much more often with this. But utility game overall, Blink and Counterspell, those are competing with each other heavily. Are you better at landing counterspells? Maybe that's better to go for that one. Are you bad at landing counterspells? Maybe better to go for the Blink. It's probably where you might want to draw the line with this one because they're actually so close. Now, that's going to be it here for the Fire Mage. My initial assessments are that it's really awesome to have some unique flavor brought back to the specialization that it was lacking. Concerns are it being an underperformer. Because of these changes, it's not getting the same type of firepower that it used to have, especially with the gear that you had towards the end of Battle for Azeroth. So it's likely to be a bit behind the pack in my mind, unless they tune it not to be. But as the expansion progresses and you get more gear and you get more comfortable with the changes to it and the way Ignite works, I think it's a specialization that could be really awesome. Hopefully in PvP and maybe just in general in the game, its damage outside of combustion is more relevant. That is one thing that I would like to see because it seems like it is so reliant on it at the moment as it was in Battle for Azeroth. And that is a big concern for me, especially for PvP. And then also moderately for PvE. But it's getting a lot of cool niche abilities. It looks like a pretty cool spec. Just performance-wise, I'm a bit worried about it. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel. Check out my other class reviews as I'm reviewing every single specialization. If you really got your eyes set on something, I'm going to be going over it in detail. And then I've got tier lists where I summarize all of the classes, give my own personal opinion on where I see their placings in terms of how long can I play a specialization without getting bored of it, because I think it's the most important factor, because you're going to be really committed to characters in Shadowlands. You want to make sure you pick something that when you're invested into it, you're not going to be bored of 2 months down the pipeline. So this is the main purpose of the channel, to be a resource for you. I hope you enjoyed the content. Like the video if you liked it. Leave a comment down below if you think that I've missed something or you just want to talk about something, because again, this is the importance of this channel is to be a resource for everybody moving into the Shadowlands to make the right choice for your gameplay. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.